Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Troy.
Thanks, Emmett. So, welcome everyone to my talk. Today I'm going to be talking about our product Nagios XI and the best practices we have for the product. Just a little bit about me first. I'm a tech support contractor for Nagios Enterprises. I live in Australia, so generally I cover the end of the US day for the next 8 hours onwards. I've been doing that since June 2014, and typically it's my 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. that I do. So if you're in those parts of the globe, you'll be talking to me. I've been using Nagios and Nagios XI since 2009, and do a bit of my own development as the pseudonym Box293, and I've also been lucky enough to be a MVP award winner 3 times. But not anymore, seeing as I work for them. I'll leave that for other people. So today is all about best practices. It's about getting the most from XI. We're talking about time-saving information and configuration items. The thing about best practices are that they are relative to your environment. So some things in this talk will apply to your environment, other things nothing to do with you. Hopefully, by the end of this talk, you'll be able to walk away with something that you didn't know. If you don't, then you need to come and work for us. We're always looking for new people. So I'm going to first start off with the XI server internals themselves. Starting off with license entitlements. So when you purchase your copy of XI, what do you actually get? You can use that license on 3 running instances of XI. You can have a production machine, and that is the one that is allowed to do all of the actual monitoring and the alerting. Your test and dev and your disaster recovery instances are allowed to run and be activated, but they're not really allowed to do any monitoring. But for test and development, you want to be able to configure it and make sure that the new plugin you want to use works before you dump it into your production environment. So that's completely fine. And the disaster recovery is also a great method for making sure when something goes wrong, you've got an instance ready to go, activated, you can just run a restore and off you go. And the license itself is activated to the IP addresses or tied to of each of those XI hosts. So when you try to activate the 4th time, you'll get, sorry, you can't do that, and you'll need to contact sales. So if you had a test and dev box that died and you needed to run another one up on a different address, let us know, and from there we can deactivate the old one and get the new one working for you. So probably one of the most important things about monitoring is making sure that the monitoring application is working. We need to make sure that, say, if XI dies, how are you going to know about it? Because you really want to know when something goes wrong. So what we have is we have a wizard called the Nagios XI Server Monitoring Wizard. And there are about 6 or 7 services it creates. And those services do the normal checks of making sure that the monitoring engine is running, alerts are enabled, the database maintenance plans are running, a few different things like that. But what's the point of monitoring it on the server itself? Because if the server dies, you're not going to hear that the server's dead. Everything's going to be fine. So this is where these extra licenses can be used. Take your DR license and use it to monitor your production environment and send alerts out when the production environment, it's not working correctly. These database maintenance jobs aren't running or the monitoring engines are not running. And that's really good, but then make sure the production instance monitors the DR instance, because you want to know if the DR dies so that when the production dies, you hear about it from the DR. So it's that sort of cross-monitoring to find out. You just want to make sure everything's healthy. So it's a really good use of your DR license where you're still monitoring from it, but we want you to be happy and have a working product. So when you buy XI, it comes with a local host object and a bunch of services. Now we also, these are some basic services, but we also have a list of things that we think you should monitor in case something goes wrong. We don't put them bundled into the box because sometimes the plugins don't come part of the standard plugins package, or there could be a number of reasons. And we don't want to overcomplicate a fresh install. But this, what I'm going to go through now, are a bunch of different items that you should be checking, which hopefully should avoid major problems. You detect them before they occur. So starting off with is making sure the services are running, and there's just a basic list of services there. The last two, the SNMP Trap D and the SNMP TT services, don't exist until you've installed the XI, you run the XI installation script for setting up SNMP traps. And once they do, those servers will be set up to start and running. So you just want to make sure they're running, and then what I've got there in the bold is the actual plugin that you can find on the Nagios Exchange, and you'll find that on the following pages. These are the plugins you can go and find. Now don't think you have to mad rush write all this down. You'll be able to download these presentations later and get all the information you need. So with XI, it generates a horrendous amount of files, and it deletes those files or it updates those files. So that generates a lot of disk I/O. If one of the services stop for any particular reason, then you can actually get these files start to accumulate in a directory, in certain different directories like the spool directory or SNMP TT or performance data. When that gets to 100,000 at least, the system can no longer process those files. So it just becomes a bigger problem. It can eat all the inodes on your disk subsystem or chew up all your disk space. So just these directories that you have configured, and I haven't given you the exact locations because they can change based on your environment, but just monitor these directories, and if it's over 1,000 files, then send a warning out. And you'll know about it then before it becomes a major issue. And sometimes you don't know. You mightn't go in and look at your performance graphs and notice that there's no data there for 2 weeks. But in that time period, you've noticed your server's getting slower and slower. So a good example of finding out about it before it happens. Another unusual problem that happens is in some installations, the Nagios user account itself can be expired, generally based on the principles of a particular environment and their security concerns. So you just run a check there that will check if the account has expired. And this is an example of monitoring that's auditing and not so much performance metrics gathering. I really like monitoring from an auditing perspective as well. You might set a standard in place but at some point someone might make a change to that standard. So how do you know it continues to stay standardized? So this is an example of where you can use a plugin to make sure that your standard is in place. Even if you have accounts that do expire, you'll find out about them 20 days before they expire, not after they've expired and caused all the problems. So typically, if you're not a Linux guy, like myself when I first started, you have no idea what the root mailbox is. Linux has an internal mailbox system, and certain programs, when they have issues, will shoot an email to that mailbox. And that mailbox is local to that server. In XI, there are certain processes that run every 5 minutes, and if they have an error, they will send an email to this mailbox. But like I said, if you're a bit of a Windows guy and have no idea that that's happening, before you know it, you might have 288 messages generated per day in that mailbox, and over time, that mailbox will get 4 gig in size. So I have a little plugin I wrote for this one, and it will just tell you how many messages are in there. You can go and clear the messages out and it's all okay, or resolve the real problem. MRTG is a common contributor to the mailbox. It runs every 5 minutes for the router bandwidth graphs, and by default it will look at a lot of all the ports on a switch rather than just the ones you selected in a wizard. So by identifying in the messages what ports it's complaining about, you can then go and comment them out in the configs and so forth, and that'll stop the errors. And I'll explain more about that later. Now there's one database system generally uses the MySQL or the MariaDB. In later versions of Linux in the Red Hat and CentOS 7, it's now called MariaDB, and that has something to do with a fork in the community, and that's just how it happens. It's open source. So what can happen sometimes is the database tables can crash, and normally XI picks up on that and will repair it in the background before you even are aware of it. Sometimes you might see it flash on the screen that it's currently repairing the tables. But there are some tables that go unnoticed, and if it goes unnoticed for a long time, the data, like log file entries, might not get written into the database, so you might miss a lot of auditing data that you wanted. So I have another plugin there you can run, and it will just tell you if the tables have crashed on the database. Another really important thing that doesn't pop up that often, when your date and time in the SQL server, the MySQL server, is separate or running on a different clock, or it drifts from the system clock. Doesn't happen very often, but it gets very difficult to troubleshoot. So it's, once again, a bit more of an auditing check. I have a plugin there, you can just check that the two match, and it'll report if there's a drift of any major amount, and will warn you when that happens. All of these things don't happen on every system, but it's when you're troubleshooting it, when you go down one of those troubleshooting adventures that I find I end up doing all the time. Usually the problem is not related to the actual cause, and you end up pulling your hair out more than you need to. So load is another one to check. It's a combination of memory and CPU and those sorts of things. So that is one of the checks that is built into the XI by default. Memory free and swap usage are tied directly to each other. If your XI server doesn't have enough free memory, then it will start to swap to disk. That swapping to disk will slow down XI because it needs to, disk is much slower than memory. So when that happens, it just causes bottlenecks in the system. So we already have a swap usage check built into XI by default, but there's a memory free one as well you need to run, and that will just tell you how much physical free memory you have. And of course, free disk space. You need to find out how much disk space is available, and we have that built into the XI. But if you're a custom install where you've changed the mount paths, you might have multiple disks, one for the temp vol or var log, or one for user local, then you're going to need to make sure that you monitor each of those mount points to make sure any one of those disks don't run out of space. Because otherwise it will cause database issues, because it can't write to the disk because there's no disk. I know it's obvious, but it's good to point these things out. Date and time is a really big problem if it's not correct. There's a date and time on the hardware clock, there's a date and time in PHP, and there's a date and time on the OS itself. This is all built in to configure it via the admin managed system config. But if you do have some troubles, you can get our documentation, make sure it matches and it's correct. It's important to make sure that if it's a virtual machine, don't have the virtual machine syncing its time with the hardware, the hypervisor that's virtualizing it. You should rely on NTP time sources. They don't have to be external NTP time sources. They can be your own internal NTP server, but make sure it's set up and working. And there are some plugins that you can check to make sure the NTP is correct and up to date. But that can be one of those other troubleshooting adventures, date and time zone incorrect. It can waste a lot of time. So your physical or virtual XI server and it is important to have the right amount of CPU cores, but also the speed of the cores is quite important in certain situations. I mean, a XI is built on a lot of little different products, and not all of those products are multi-threaded. So for those non-multi-threaded products, a 3.4 gigahertz CPU is going to do things a lot quicker than a 2.2 gigahertz CPU. It's still important to increase the numbers of cores, but if you're doing hardware purchasing, it's important to make sure you don't skimp on the quality of the CPUs you're getting. There's no real difference in a virtualized VM of XI and a physical one. These days, it's more about why wouldn't you virtualize? There's not much difference. All of the virtualization hypervisors are up to date with the latest technologies to make sure you get the most performance out of the systems. Now, I brought this up before with memory. So when XI is running and it's healthy and there's not many services that are down, generally speaking, you should have 50% more memory available on the system for an outage. And what is an outage? An outage is you could have a switch that connects to 30 servers. If you pull the plug on that switch, that's going to affect all of those hosts, all of those services. It'll initiate event handlers to run when things go into a hard state. And event handlers consume memory quickly. I've done tests with just set up systems in my own home with once you, in a matter of minutes, 6 or 7 gigs of memory can be consumed just because you've made a major outage occur and each of these event handlers is running to fire off events like notifications and so forth. And I'll go more into ways to alleviate that from happening because you don't always need event handlers running. We do have a sizing document about your hardware requirements, how many checks you're going to run versus how much memory and CPU you need. However, some of this also relates to where the plugins are running and what type of plugins they are. Your SNMP plugins, your Perl plugins, they can use a lot of CPU and a lot of memory, which can really bog down your server, or you might have a beefy enough server but not enough memory to actually cope with all of those happening at once. So it's another one of those, it's a best practice, but it's flexible to your environment. A RAM disk is great for XI. It's one of the most, one of the things I suggest the most often with client systems. Basically, I talked earlier about how all these little files are created in XI for processing of performance data, of spool files, those sorts of things. By simply using some of your memory as a file system, as a RAM disk, the time it takes is far less because it doesn't have to go all the way down to a spinning disk and then come all the way back again. It can just hit the RAM disk and come back off. You will notice major differences in speed once you implement the RAM disk. We have official procedure to follow to set this up and get it running. The size of it will vary depending on how many checks you have, but generally speaking, it's something that I suggest that if you don't already do it, go back and get it implemented. The next big thing that's really helped a lot is SSDs. As you understand, there's no spinning disk. It's just a solid-state disk that's almost instant in how it can read and write. It's far superior to your older disks, the spinning disks. It really does help with your performance graphs, database, anything that needs to be read from the disk quite a lot, or even written. You still want to use the RAM disk as well. The solid-state disk is not like a complete replacement and you don't need to use a RAM disk because it's quick enough to do it all. You still want to use the RAM disk because it's still got to go through the PCI bus and so forth, and hit the disk subsystem, then come all the way back again, whereas a RAM disk bypasses a lot of those mechanics. And SSDs, you want to avoid writing too much with them. They're much better nowadays, but it's just something that's worth keeping in mind. So what about SSD versus RAID? I mean, SSD will still beat a spinning disk RAID set, depending on how much money you've got to spend. But at the end of the day, if you're going to look at using SSDs, you should still implement the SSDs in a RAID 1 for redundancy, because everything's going to fail at one point. Now, SSDs may not give you the capacity that you want, so you may look at using certain locations just for SSD on your system, and other locations for storage and logs and those sorts of things. But I've now seen a month or two ago that one of the brand manufacturers have released a 3.8 terabyte SAS SSD. So that's quite a lot of storage, and it really reduces the hindrance of SSD that has been up till now, where only 1 or 2 terabyte size disks are available. And if you had 4 of those in a RAID 10, then really you're up to like 7.2 something terabytes, 7.6. It's well worth investigating, but you've got to get past the budget people and all that as well. We've all been there. RRD cached. Before I talked about all those performance data files being generated in the disk subsystem, every time a performance data, a service check result was received, it has performance data. The performance data is put into a file. Another process comes along, gets that file, looks at the data, puts it in your round-robin databases. That's fine for most systems, but as you start to get into the tens of thousands of checks, as you can imagine, it's a lot of IA going on for all of these checks. So RRD cached is a way of spooling, accumulating these checks into singular files, and then they get processed on a 15-minute interval. Or not, the interval can be changed, but it's a way of preventing it all from happening all the time, and then it comes along and just does it in a batch job and gets it out of the way. You will only notice performance gains in the larger implementations of XI, as I said, the tens of thousands of services. However, also be aware that because it's delaying the processing of the performance data, your graphs themselves will be delayed in the data that you see appearing. You'll still see the most recent result in the service check and in the advanced tab of the service or host in XI, but you just won't see the graph until a little bit longer. And once again, we have an official procedure to follow to get this implemented. Offloading MySQL and Maria is something that you should look at doing when you have large installations. Again, we're talking when you're starting to get past 10,000 services, or your services have a chunk of returning status information data. That all has to get inserted into MySQL databases. What can end up happening is you have all of this processing power being devoted to just putting data into databases, as opposed to doing the actual monitoring. So we have an official procedure to offload MySQL to another server. Don't forget to monitor it once you offload it, because that server will need memory, disk space, and they're all going to run out at some time, and you're going to go on one of those troubleshooting adventures again once you realise that you weren't monitoring this and everyone's pulling their hair out and they can't work out why it's not working. Yep, that's everything on that one. Mod Daemon has been used in the past for offloading the actual processing of the plugins to workers, taking it away from the actual monitoring engine process and letting workers go and do the work, so to speak. Now, these workers can be just on the XI server itself, and they can be external workers, physically separate, offloaded from the XI host. With moddaemon, any worker that's going to process checks needs to be, that all of the plugins it's going to use need to be installed on the workers. There are some oddities that occur here. The WMI checks are a good example, where they generate temp files in the temp directory. So if you've got 3 workers and at interval 5 minutes, a worker does a check, puts the information in the temp file, returns the data back to Nagios. 10 minutes later, the next check happens, but worker 2 does it. And worker 2 doesn't have that temp directory. So it puts a new check result there, and then the next time it could be worker 3 that gets it. So it never sees this temp file, or it might be the 4th time when worker 1 gets it again. It might get the information and see it's in the temp file, but that's 4 checks old, or 3 checks old. So with some of these plugins, you need to be aware of either you can use moddaemon and configure it to not process certain host and service checks and just let the XI server deal with those, or you can configure like NFS shares or NFS mount points on all the workers so they always have access to that same data location. Another method is you can group services or host objects together so that worker will always do those checks. So in the temp files example, they will always be done on that server, so those checks will always be consistent. With XI 2014 onwards, we introduced Core 4, and Core 4 then had its own workers. So if you just had an XI server and no external workers, there is no longer any need for moddaemon. But if you want to offload the load to other workers and let Nagios just do monitoring and not actual executing of the plugins, then you're still going to need to implement moddaemon. One of the things I've missed in the slides that I'm going to talk about quickly is with moddaemon, it has queues, and the workers are assigned to queues. Moddaemon in a default install puts all of the host checks in a host queue and all the service checks in a service queue. Then you have your 2 or 3 workers. Those workers go, what have you got in the host queue? What have you got in the service queue? I'm doing it, thanks, here's a result. Works great. However, when I went through all the earlier slides that were about the local host services, those services are specific to the local XI server. So if a worker goes and executes that check on itself, then the results for that are for that worker, not for the XI local host server. So you can configure moddaemon to either exclude, you can create a host group or a service group of hosts or services that you don't want moddaemon to process, and you can put them, and you can configure the moddaemon config files so it will know, right, anything in there doesn't get processed. Or you can tell workers, like I said before, your job is to do these. So you can have the local worker on XI just do the local services. The MRTG services are another good example for the routers and switch wizards. You need to tell the MRT, well, you need to tell Nagios and the moddaemon module what you do and don't want to be offloaded. We have an official procedure about getting moddaemon implemented. It's a great tool, and I recommend you give it a go if it suits your environment. Right, so disaster recovery, as we all know, is very important. But disaster recovery is different for everyone. I'm not really going to go into this because Andy Briss last year did a great talk on this, and you just need to go and look on the online, have a look at what's going on. He can explain it all to you. But really the point I want to give you now is determine what is important in a disaster. And once you know that, then you can plan and test. Backups are super important. So you can schedule backups in XI. You can do them to a local location or an FTP or an SSH, but it's really important that the backups be available after there's a failure. There's no point storing them locally and then you can't get to the backups on the disk subsystem when your server dies. There's a full, you can manually create backups through the admin menu, and you can also go to the CLI and run the backup script, and away you go. Restoring backups is very straightforward. There's a procedure for that. It's also very good for taking the system, taking XI from one system to another system. If you wanted to migrate from, say, CentOS 6.5 or 6.6 or whatever to CentOS 7, or from 32-bit to 64-bit. Some files don't get pulled across in some of the instances with the 64-bit and 32-bit. There's some compatibilities, but you'll work it out. So I'm going to run through some configuration options. One of the problems people get into is that with hosts and services, they will have, for all the host objects and all the service objects, the same intervals. Normally, the logic in XI or in Nagios Core is when a host goes down, suppress the services from doing work, or suppress the services from sending notifications. But if you have the situation where your hosts and the services execute at the same time, then you can get a condition where some of the services will go critical before the actual host goes down. So you want to make sure you look at having, the key thing is, make sure your host goes down hard, quicker than its services. And that will suppress the notifications. The data will still be collected, the checks will still be run, but you won't get notifications for the services. So you can get around this with a couple of different methods. Service dependencies is a great one. So when you configure a master service like ping or NRPE, and you can say all of these other services depend on this master service. So when the master service goes down, you can either say, don't send notifications or don't execute the checks, the dependent services. And that don't execute is a really good one, because if the host is down and you can't get to it, then there's no point executing the checks and wasting CPU cycles and memory and disk and all that stuff to find out that it's not done. So the dependencies are great. You can have host or service dependencies. Now that can get complicated. However, there is a new system-wide directive called Host Down Disable Service Checks, and this is in Nagios Core 4.1, which is included in XI5. And what this does is as simple as it says. Think of it as automatic service dependencies on their own hosts. So if the host goes down, it will not execute any service checks for that host itself. And also, if that host had service dependencies, they will be ignored if the host is down, because that's part of the sort of rule, this global system-wide setting. It makes a big difference in massive systems with tens of thousands of checks when you have a major system outage. Once that host is down, there's no point in running all those checks that aren't necessary. With the check intervals, is it really important to check everything every 5 minutes? I mean, hard drive space is rarely going to run out within 5 minutes. You're going to know about that well ahead of time if you've got the right thresholds. So by changing it to a larger interval like 60 minutes will make things much better. Things will perform better. But if you have the intervals too long, then you'll have no performance data at all. But if you're going to go ahead and start changing intervals, then instead of making it every 60 minutes, why not every 58 minutes or every 62 minutes? You think about just randomising some of that check scheduling that can occur instead of having these waves of 5 minutes, 30 minutes, 10 minutes, 60-minute intervals. There's just different ways to think of things. You can get in instances with notifications and check intervals where, if I take a step back for a second, Nagios determines when it should send a notification every time a service check is in a hard state and it executes. If you have similar notification intervals and service check intervals, you can have scenarios where you might fall short of the notification window, the next notification window, by 20 seconds, which means it might be another 15 minutes before the actual notification is sent. So it's quite hard to explain on screen. I do have some guides on my website that go into a full scenario about how this works. So it's just worth thinking about if you're trying to get really restrictive on intervals and find out and make sure they go out as soon as possible, but they're in larger windows, make sure it's possible for it to happen. Host groups is another good one. And before I get going, I know I'm going to run out of time soon and I've got a few more slides, so I might buzz through. But host groups are a way of assigning a service to a common bunch of servers to make sure monitoring standards are enforced and then consistent. So instead of running a wizard and creating a bunch of services just for that host, and every host you create has its own bunch of services, you can just create one service and assign it to a host group, and that host group will apply those services to all of those hosts. So you get the same standards enforced. You make sure that if you want to change one threshold, it's changed across the board. It's very powerful. Contact groups are even more powerful in the sense of one of the most common questions we get is, how do we add a contact to a bunch of groups, or how do we remove a contact from a bunch of hosts or services? If you have, if you start off using contact groups, it's very easy just to go in and add someone to a group and remove someone from a group rather than having to find all the objects. You can use the bulk modification tools to actually find all those objects and make the changes, but that's only in the Enterprise edition of the license. So you need to make sure you plan ahead. If you don't have the Enterprise edition of the license, you can activate the trial and make the changes, and those changes will stay after the trial finishes. But you can make sure you implement the groups that way if you haven't done that before. Configuration wizards are great, but when you talk about having these standards and making bulk changes, they don't apply as good for the larger environments. So it's important you can use the wizards to learn how something is monitored, how we suggest you monitor something, and then once you understand it, then you can go and use those services and assign those services to host groups and make it enforced out with standards. Templates is another part of XI or core that talks about, it makes standards get enforced and reduces your administrative overhead. Templates can be layered and they can be additive or they can ignore. A really good example is all the XI wizards use a host template for its host check. And it's the same ping check across the board. They get quite complicated and they don't apply to every situation, but if you start getting into it, you understand the different scenarios where it applies really well, enforcing your standards across the board. So I'm going to have to wind this up because I have jumped out of time, but very quickly, user macros are something for common passwords and passwords and things that have special characters. Custom object variables are a way of storing variables in host objects or service objects, and it makes Nagios even more powerful. And I have other stuff. I talked about the MRTG stuff. Plugins, compiled or scripts, you should look at some are slower and some are faster. We have a back-end API. You should make sure that that's a read-only user. I have a performance data tool that helps you look at ROD files and those sorts of things and analyse data that's not via graphs. And that's it. Sorry I ran a bit fast there, but I'm here for the entire conference, so if you've got any questions about any of this, come and ask me and we can have a healthy discussion about it.
All right, well, thank you, Troy. Looks like we got about 10 minutes here for any questions. Does anybody here have any questions for Troy? I can come around personally with the microphone.
So he'll bring a microphone over to you, and if you just wait for that.
Troy, what's the URL for your website?
Sites.box293.com and /Nagios. If you just Google, you'll find it linked in any of my plugins and components on the Nagios Exchange. I go through a lot of configuration examples for how to do plugin checks, like check disk space. Is it free or is it used? The arguments are subtly different, but it's there in clear text because I get a bit confused myself.
Any other questions for Troy? Troy, do you have any upcoming projects or anything you're currently working on that you'd like to share with us?
I did have what I call the check profiler component for Nagios XI, and it's a way of having a summarised report of all of the services and how long they took to execute and their latency. And you can view, it'll also give you a summary of that data together so that you can see that this Perl plugin that does SNMP stuff is taking 45 seconds, but everything else is fine. So you can go in, do some investigation and go from there. That is available right now. It's a little bit buggy with some of the JSON stuff it does in the core back end. So bear with me, that'll get updated when it works. If I've still got time, I can flick back and explain some of the other things I script past really quick. Mainly the plugins is a good one, where compiled plugins will run quicker, but they're harder to update on the fly. If you decide that you want to change how it outputs the information on the screen, then you have to go and edit the original source files, recompile and redeploy. But they're generally faster and use less resources. Scripts themselves will run slower because they run more modules and they use more than you really need sometimes. However, you can change stuff inside very quickly and they just work. Something I have tried recently is using the nice command to reduce the resource, the process priority, the priority that the plugin runs at. So it still gets allowed to run with the same amount of resources, but not at the impact of the actual other higher processes. It's varied, the results that gives, but it is a way of sometimes squeezing a little bit more performance out of your system. And that was that check profiler component I talked about.
Hello, my name is Kanak. I have a question about service and template configuration. So we are using service groups and templates. Is there any way we can get the report host-based service configuration report so it will be easier to identify which service I'm using?
We don't have a report system at the moment. Really, in XI5 we have an API that's now available. This is new, and you can do xpost, xdelete, and xget through curl commands. So you can actually query. You can do a get command for a service or for an object, and you should be able to find out the relationships. Or you can get a get command, get this host. What are its relationships? It's in this host group, and then you'll be able to go and get command on the host group. Where is the host group's relationships? And then you'll find out it's used by these services. Is that similar? Is that an answer to what you're actually asking?
Yep.
Like, it's fully documented. It's very new, but it's in the full release of XI5. It's in the help section API. There's full examples on how to use it.
Thank you.
Does that work if you've got your host? Because you can define host groups two different ways.
Yes.
Private members or a list within the host group object configuration.
So his question is, Normally in configurations, you have two options for defining a host, how to use host groups, whether it's via in the host object configuration itself or going to the host group and saying, here are the hosts that are in this group. And you can only see one from one way and not the other, or it gets complicated. I don't have a really good answer on that right now because I haven't had time to actually delve into the API, but it should still give you the relationships where the host group is used. But that is a really good question, and one of the devs may know, or they should know, but whether or not you can lock them down. But chase me down later, or ask one of us other admins and see if we can find out an answer before you leave the conference.
In addition of the information that you have in this conference, do you have some paper that explain all to that, say, today? Maybe a paper that write the best practices for Nagios.
Pretty much all getting this slideshow is a summation of all of our KB articles, you could say. But maybe we'll put together a PDF that links all of these topics together. And yeah, we can do that.
In your installations, you have many. I am thinking about a replicate in many instances Nagios. Do you have a special procedure to do consulting and to do an implementation? It may be like five steps to deliver the.
Not at this point. You would have to speak to one of the developers about that one, I think, or one of the sales guys. I'm not entirely sure on that one at this point in time. I do a lot in support, but I don't deal a lot in that sort of deployment section of the product.
Okay, thank you.
But chase us down through the conference and we can ask other people in the team and see if we can find out a better answer for you.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions?
It's not so much a question. I just want to say that all those things would have been really good to hear a couple of years ago when we went from a small installation to a large installation. So my advice to everybody who is doing that, to take everything that he just said as gospel. That was great. Thank
Brian
you.
has a lot of tens of thousands of checks. He did a talk last year. I advise you have a look at it. He talks about some different ways to get around some of these issues that I have presented as well. But I'm glad to hear that what we're saying actually works. Anyone else? Excellent. Well, one more.
Got enough time for about one more here.
Yep.
You mentioned the workers out there doing the work. Would XI work with Core 3 in that setup, or do we have to upgrade our remote machines to 4?
In that instance, the workers are actually Gearman workers. So as long as the Gearman workers are the same version as the one used on the XI server, there should be no issues. But the plugin packages, for instance, get updated on the XI server, like plugins 2.1 or 0.3 or something now. Well, you should make sure that they're being used across the board. It's really make sure your plugins are up to date, because that's what is being executed out in the field.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, once again, Troy Lee.